The room was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the kind of joy that only a wedding can bring. I was seated at the family table, watching my son begin a new chapter of his life. My heart was full. But then, my grandson tugged gently at my sleeve. His voice, small yet deliberate, cut through the noise. "Grandpa, look under the table." At first I thought it was a child's game. Maybe he wanted me to find some candy he had dropped, or maybe it was just mischief. But the urgency in his eyes told me otherwise. Slowly I leaned forward, bent down, and peered beneath the long white tablecloth that draped across the polished oak. And what I saw changed everything. There, hidden in the shadows where no one else could see, was a truth that had been buried for years. A secret no one expected to surface on this day of celebration. A revelation that threatened to shatter the joy in the room and expose wounds our family had worked hard to ignore. At that moment, the wedding hall seemed to shrink. The music faded, the laughter dimmed, and I was left with a question that pierced my soul. Do I protect the harmony of this moment, or do I pull the thread that unravels it all? Here's what that moment teaches us. Sometimes life does not ask us if we are ready for truth. Sometimes it places the truth right under our feet, waiting for the courage of one person to lift the cloth. And yet, courage has a cost. This story is not just about a wedding, a secret, or a family fracture. It's about the choices we make when hidden truths collide with public celebration. It's about resilience, justice, and the silent power of the overlooked. Because what I discovered beneath that table would force me, and everyone in that room, to face a history we had been running from for generations. Long before the wedding day, before the flowers and fine suits, there was a story running beneath the surface of our family, one that nobody wanted to tell out loud. My son, the groom, grew up in a house that carried both pride and silence. Pride in our resilience, in the fact that we had endured what others said would break us. Silence, because certain truths were considered too heavy to be spoken at the dinner table. But silence doesn't erase history, it only buries it, and what is buried has a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times. To understand why my grandson's whisper mattered that day, you have to understand where we came from. Our family, like many others, carried the scars of systemic injustice, not just the loud, visible kind. The police harassment, the job discrimination, the constant battle to prove worth in spaces built to exclude us, but also the quiet, corrosive kind. The kind that eats into relationships, that shapes the way fathers and sons talk to each other, the way daughters protect themselves, the way secrets are passed from one generation to the next, like an inheritance no one asked for. My son grew up watching me work 2, sometimes 3 jobs. He saw me come home bone-tired, carrying both exhaustion and unspoken rage, and though I thought I was shielding him, children always see more than we realize. Here's what that moment teaches us. Injustice doesn't just live outside our doors, it seeps into our homes. It bends our voices, it changes our silences, and it teaches our children lessons we never meant to pass down. The root cause wasn't just family drama, it was the weight of years, centuries, even of being told to survive quietly, of being told to celebrate loudly, but suffer silently. And somewhere in that mix, a fracture had formed between father and son. That fracture widened when love and loyalty pulled in different directions. My son made choices I did not always understand, choices influenced by a need to belong in spaces that were never designed for us. And in those choices, some truths were hidden, some betrayals were overlooked, and some wounds were simply left to fester. By the time the wedding came, we all knew, somewhere deep inside, that the day wasn't just about love. It was about whether we could carry those fractures into the next generation, or whether they would finally split open in front of everyone. And my grandson, too young to carry the weight, yet brave enough to notice what adults ignored, became the one to point at the wound. Because children, unfiltered and untrained in silence, often see what we've trained ourselves not to. When I lifted my eyes back up from under that table, I knew in an instant this was not a child's prank. It was a revelation. A truth that my grandson in his innocence had stumbled upon and now placed in my hands. The question that burned in me was simple but heavy. Do I stay silent, or do I speak? This is the fork in the road every family, every community, every individual eventually faces. There are moments when silence preserves comfort, but at the cost of integrity. And there are moments when truth risks everything, but in doing so, opens the door to transformation. I glanced at my son, the groom, radiant, standing at the altar. I saw his new bride beaming with hope. I saw guests laughing, cameras flashing, joy spilling across the room like champagne. And I asked myself, was this the right time to expose a wound? But wounds do not wait for perfect timing. They bleed when they choose. Here's what that moment teaches us. A moral fork in the road never appears on our schedule. It always shows up when it is least welcome, and it demands that we answer even if our voice trembles. The weight was heavier because this wasn't just about one man, one wedding, one secret. It was about generations of choices that had brought us here. Choices made in fear, in pride, in survival. Choices that kept us alive, but also kept us bound. I knew that silence would protect my son's moment. It would preserve the picture-perfect image for the cameras, the kind that could be framed on a wall. But silence would also hand the next generation, my grandson's generation, the same poisoned inheritance we had carried for so long, the habit of ignoring what is right in front of us. Speaking out, on the other hand, could shatter everything. It could stain this day forever, divide a family already hanging by threads, and expose pain in public view. And yet, was that not the very medicine we had always avoided? The confrontation that had been delayed so many times passed from father to son like a curse. At that table, I wasn't just a father or a grandfather. I was a keeper of history, and history was asking for an answer. The truth was pressing at my lips, like a tide rising against a dam, but I held it back. For one more breath, for one more moment. Because I realized this, the choice I made now would not only determine the fate of this wedding, it would determine the story my grandson tells about courage. And that was the real fork in the road. As I sat there, the weight of choice pressing on my chest, I realized something. The real test of power is not always found in loud declarations. Sometimes it hides in the quiet. I thought of my grandmother, a woman who never raised her voice, but whose silence carried an authority that made entire rooms adjust themselves. She taught me that real intelligence is not about showing force, but about reading the battlefield and choosing your move with precision. And in that moment, staring at my son at the altar and my grandson beside me, I felt her lessons return. Here's what that moment teaches us. Power is not always the ability to control others. Sometimes it is the ability to control yourself. What no one else in that wedding hall knew was that my grandson's small whisper had already shifted the balance. He, in his innocence, had revealed something that others overlooked. That was the first glimpse of hidden brilliance, the ability of the unseen, the underestimated, to move the story forward. It reminded me of a truth I had buried in my own journey. I had always thought my role as a father was to shield, to protect, to cover the family's scars so the world would not use them against us. But maybe my role as a grandfather was different. Maybe it was not to hide wounds, but to help the next generation learn how to heal them. I began to notice subtle details around me, things that had seemed unimportant before, but now felt like signals. The way my son avoided eye contact when certain relatives spoke. The way my grandson's eyes darted toward that table again, restless, as if urging me to act. Even the way the bride's family, sitting across the aisle, carried themselves with guarded smiles, as though they knew more than they were letting on. This wasn't just a celebration. It was a stage, and beneath the music and dancing, strategy was already at play. A single action could flip the entire outcome. I remembered something I once taught my own son when he was small. Never underestimate what people aren't saying. Silence has weight, and if you listen closely, it tells you exactly where the cracks are. The cracks were here now, widening. And though I hadn't yet decided what to do, I understood this. My grandson had given me an unexpected advantage. A piece of hidden intelligence that, if used wisely, could change the course of the day, and perhaps the course of our family. Because sometimes, the most underestimated person in the room, a child, a quiet elder, the overlooked guest, holds the key to unraveling an entire system of deception. And this child, my grandson, had just placed that key in my hands. Power never reveals itself without resistance. The moment I recognized that my grandson had handed me the key, the world seemed to tighten its grip, as if it sensed the shift. I saw it in the way a relative, one who had always doubted my place in family matters, leaned across the table with a smirk. His words were meant as a toast, but his tone was laced with an undercurrent of mockery. It's a blessing that he turned out so well, despite everything. Despite everything, those two words landed like stones in my chest. They weren't just casual remarks. They were echoes of years of judgment, the whispered doubts, the unspoken blame, the assumption that my family's strength was an accident rather than the product of endurance. The room erupted in polite laughter, but I felt the old sting of humiliation. It was the same sting I had felt in boardrooms, where I was underestimated, in schools where teachers looked at my son as though his potential was capped before he even tried, in grocery stores where my family was followed down aisles as though survival itself was a crime. Humiliation is never about the moment itself. It is about the history it drags behind it. Here's what that moment teaches us. Systemic obstacles don't just live in institutions. They live in the smallest interactions, in the way words can slice open scars you thought had healed. As I sat there, holding my grandson's secret close, I felt the pressure building. The joyful celebration was now laced with tension only I could feel. My son, oblivious, continued smiling, making vows that carried more weight than anyone in the room yet realized. But inside me, doubt was gnawing. Maybe silence really was safer. Maybe revealing the truth would only confirm what the world already suspected, that families like ours are fragile, fractured, incapable of holding joy without it breaking. And then, the crack widened. During the reception, a story was told. A funny anecdote, meant to entertain, but it wasn't funny to me. It exposed too much of what we had worked to keep private. A slip of the tongue that made my son's past choices the subject of public laughter. The room chuckled, unaware of the knife it had twisted. I looked at my son. For the first time that day, his smile faltered. His shoulders sank ever so slightly. It was the look of a man who had tried his whole life to rise above judgment, only to find himself dragged back down in the very moment he should have been lifted up. And in that instant, I realized we had reached the breaking point. Every family has one, the moment when silence can no longer protect, when the weight of unspoken truths presses too hard, and when the entire foundation trembles. The wedding was still happening around us, music, dancing, glasses raised. But for me, the world narrowed. It was no longer a party. It was a battlefield. And if I didn't choose carefully, this would be the day we lost more than our composure. We would lose the very chance to redeem what had been broken for generations. Every great story has a moment when everything seems lost. And that moment, at my son's wedding, came wrapped in humiliation. His smile cracked, his spirit bent low, and I felt the old fear return. What if we never rise from this? But just as despair settled in, something unexpected happened. My grandson, the same child who had whispered the truth to me under the table, leaned closer once again. His voice, soft yet steady, carried more courage than his years should have allowed. "Grandpa, we can keep secrets forever." It was a sentence so simple, so pure, that it cut through generations of silence like a blade. Children have a way of speaking truths adults spend lifetimes running from. Here's what that moment teaches us. Wisdom doesn't always come from age. Sometimes, Clarity comes from the unburdened heart of a child who has not yet learned the art of hiding. And in that whisper, I felt something stir, a memory, a lesson, a spark. I remembered my own mentor, an elder in our community, a man who carried dignity in every step, despite having faced trials that would have broken most men. He once told me, "The world will always test you, but your response writes the story. Anger writes one story. Silence writes another. But courage writes the story that outlives you." That wisdom returned to me like oxygen to lungs starved of breath. For years I had confused silence with strength. I had mistaken survival for victory. But in that moment, I understood survival without truth is just another form of slow death. I sat up straighter. My pulse steadied. My mind, once clouded by shame, began to clear. If I could not confront the past for myself, then I would confront it for the sake of my grandson, so that he would inherit something better than silence. This was not about ruining a wedding. It was about rewriting a legacy. And every strategist knows, when the battlefield shifts, you do not panic. You adapt. You change the plan. You find a way to move, even if it is small, even if it is silent, until the moment is right. That day, my new plan was not to explode in anger or shatter the celebration with accusations. No, my plan was to move with precision, to prepare the ground for truth in such a way that when it surfaced, it would not destroy us, it would free us. Because sometimes transformation doesn't start with thunder. Sometimes it starts with a whisper that refuses to be ignored. The music swelled, couples swayed on the dance floor, and waiters glided through the room with trays of champagne. To the outside eye, everything was perfect. But beneath the surface, I had already shifted. The turning point was behind me. And now it was time to act. Here's what that moment teaches us. Transformation rarely begins with a roar. More often, it begins with a whisper, a decision, a subtle shift in posture that others overlook. I began with the smallest moves. A quiet word to a relative I trusted, one who knew the history but had also carried the silence. I leaned in, speaking softly, planting the idea that truth, no matter how inconvenient, might be the only path to peace. She didn't react outwardly, but I saw it in her eyes, the flicker of recognition, the acknowledgement that the day was not as flawless as it seemed. From there, I watched. I listened. I studied. Every strategist knows the importance of reconnaissance before the strike. The way certain guests shifted uncomfortably during certain speeches. The nervous laughter that escaped when old stories edged too close to forbidden truths. The guarded expressions of the bride's family, who seemed to know more than they were saying. Each detail was a breadcrumb, and I was gathering them, quietly, piece by piece. Meanwhile, I studied my son. Even in his joy, I could see the shadows, the way his jaw tightened when a past misstep was mentioned, the way his smile faltered when his own father's name was invoked. He carried the look of a man torn between gratitude for this new beginning and fear that the past might still reach for him. And then there was my grandson. He didn't understand all the layers, but he understood enough. His eyes stayed fixed on me, as if he knew I was carrying something fragile, something that could break or heal, depending on how I chose to move. A single action could flip the entire outcome. So I chose patience. I chose precision. Instead of confronting in the heat of humiliation, I began preparing for a moment when the truth could surface not as chaos, but as clarity. I asked myself, what would my mentor do? And the answer came, he would build silently, stacking small acts of courage until the foundation could hold the weight of revelation. So I sat taller. I spoke with calm authority when small disputes arose at the table, steadying the energy around me. I guided conversations away from gossip and toward reflection, letting people feel, without knowing why, that the atmosphere was shifting. Each action was invisible to most, but together they built momentum. Because that is how change often begins, not with a spectacle, but with a series of quiet moves that no one applauds, until the day comes when silence breaks, and the world sees what has been forming all along. The night was reaching its peak. Glasses clinked in a final toast, and the DJ announced the couple's first dance. My son took his bride's hand, and for a moment the room was awash in beauty. The kind of beauty people pay photographers to capture, to freeze forever. But even beauty cannot hold back truth. It happened in the most unassuming way. A relative, emboldened by too much wine, rose to tell a story. His words, careless, began to unravel the silence we had all been guarding. He joked about a choice my son had made years ago, one tied to shame, one we had all worked hard to bury. The laughter started soft, but it spread quickly, bouncing around the room until it felt as if the walls themselves were in on the humiliation. And that was the moment. The crack I had been waiting for. I stood. Not in anger, not in chaos, but in calm. The kind of calm that makes a room pay attention. My voice carried not with volume, but with weight. Enough, I said. The laughter froze mid-breath. Heads turned. The music seemed to hush itself. Here's what that moment teaches us. Authority does not come from noise. It comes from conviction. I looked directly at my son. His smile was gone, his head lowered, shame pressing down like a physical weight. I could not let that be the story he carried into this new marriage. So I spoke. I spoke the truth we had hidden. The truth my grandson had already revealed to me under the table. Not as accusation, but as revelation. Not to destroy, but to liberate. I told the story as it was, with its flaws, its pain, and its resilience. I named the silence that had poisoned us, the choices made in fear, and the strength it took to stand here now, in spite of it all. She didn't know it yet, but this wedding was never about perfection. It was about courage. And courage is not the absence of scars, it is the decision to live fully in spite of them. The room shifted. Some gasped. Some lowered their eyes. But the laughter was gone. In its place was a silence heavy with respect, with realization, with the undeniable force of truth spoken at last. My son looked up at me, tears in his eyes. For the first time that day, he was not hiding. He was free. His bride, instead of recoiling, held his hand tighter. She leaned into him, as if to say, "This is the man I chose, all of him, scars and all." And in that moment, the tables turned. What was meant to humiliate became a revelation. What was meant to divide became the foundation for unity. The truth, once buried, had become the very thing that saved us. When the words left my mouth, they didn't vanish into the air. They settled on every soul in that room like weighty stones. Truth has a way of doing that. It doesn't dissolve, it lingers, it reshapes. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was thick, charged, almost unbearable. Then, as if on cue, people shifted, some toward us, others away. A few relatives, their pride threatened, frowned and muttered under their breath. To them, my choice was betrayal. I had broken the code of silence that families use like armor. They could not yet see that silence was the enemy, not me. But others leaned forward, eyes softened with tears. They recognized something rare. Honesty in a place that had thrived on appearances. A few even whispered thank you when they passed my chair later that evening. And my son? He looked different now. Taller, lighter, as if he had been carrying a boulder on his back for years and had finally set it down. His eyes glistened with both pain and gratitude. Pain for the scars revealed, gratitude for the freedom they carried. Here's what that moment teaches us. Truth always divides before it unites. There is no redemption without disruption. The bride's family surprised me most. They had heard whispers before, but never the full story. Some might have recoiled, choosing judgment, but instead, they embraced it. Her father rose, glass in hand, and said words I will never forget. Every family carries shadows. What matters is not the shadow itself, but the courage to walk through it together. Tonight, I am proud to call your family mine. The applause that followed was not loud, not wild, but it was steady, and in its steadiness, there was strength. Of course, there were those who left early, unwilling to face the discomfort. Let them go. Transformation does not wait for the unwilling. As the night wore on, I sat with my grandson, the one who had started all of this with his innocent nudge beneath the table. He leaned against me, whispering, "I'm glad you said it." And I realized this was not just about my son. It was about him, too. About what kind of world he would grow up in. One where silence smothers truth, or one where courage gives it breath. She didn't know it yet, but his bride would look back on this wedding not as the day secrets almost destroyed them, but as the day honesty saved them. The cost of truth was real: strained glances, broken illusions, quiet anger. But the reward was greater: freedom, connection, and the seed of legacy planted in the youngest heart present. In the weeks after the wedding, the story rippled. Families whispered, neighbors speculated, and opinions divided. But within our home, something deeper had shifted. My son no longer walked as though carrying hidden chains. His laughter came easier, his conversations ran longer, and his marriage began not on the fragile ground of secrecy, but on the solid foundation of truth. The bride, now my daughter, showed a kind of strength I hadn't anticipated. She embraced the scars of her husband's past, not as blemishes, but as proof of his resilience. She didn't know it yet, but her decision that night, to hold his hand tighter instead of letting go, had already written a legacy of her own. And my grandson? He carried the wide-eyed wonder of a child who had just seen courage in real time. Someday, when he faces his own moments of silence and shame, he will remember that night, the night his grandfather stood in a crowded hall and chose truth over comfort. Here's what that moment teaches us. Legacy is not built on perfection. It is built on courage, carried forward by those who witness it. A single action flipped the entire outcome of that wedding, but more than that, it shifted the trajectory of a family. The villains of silence lost their power. The bystanders learned the cost of complicity, and the system of keep it quiet, keep it pretty, was exposed for the fragility it truly was. And now I turn to you. What are the secrets sitting under the tables of your own life? What truths remain buried because silence feels safer than revelation? Understand this: silence may protect you for a season, but it imprisons you for a lifetime. Courage, on the other hand, may break things open, but in that breaking comes freedom. So I leave you with this: choose courage, choose truth. And when your moment comes, when the room is laughing at the wrong thing, when silence feels easier, stand, speak, break the cycle. Because someone is watching. A child, a friend, a future leader. They are learning not just from what you say, but from what you dare to reveal. And that is how legacies are born.